Let's focus in on the aggregate demand curve. In front of you, you've got two different graphs that look very similar. Graph number one, which shows a movement along a single aggregate demand curve, and graph number two, which shows a shift in the aggregate demand curve. Now, keep in mind, aggregate demand measures the amount of spending in the economy, and there are four categories of spending: consumption, investment spending by businesses, consumption spending is spending by households, plus government spending, plus net exports, X minus M. So whenever one of these things changes, it impacts the aggregate demand curve. And to represent that on the model, let's take a look at a few different scenarios and see if they match with graph number one or graph number two. So first scenario is that the US economy experiences inflation, or a rise in the price level. In that case, that's represented by graph number one. In this case, if our initial price level is PL1, that corresponds with the initial level of output or initial level of spending at Y1. If we experience a rise in the price level, we diagram that as a movement along the aggregate demand curve from point A to point B and a decrease in spending. Now, there are three reasons why the aggregate demand curve is downward sloping. The wealth effect, the interest rate, and the net export effect. So make sure you check those and understand those. Now let's look at a couple of other scenarios. Let's say that incomes rise across the nation. Everyone experiences an increase in income. That could be because of maybe a tax cut, or it could be because people are just simply becoming wealthier. In that case, consumption spending is rising. However, it's not a change in the price level that's causing a change in household spending. It's a change in income. It's a change in another factor. And in that case, we represent it as a rightward shift of the aggregate demand curve. So we would move from point B to point A. So holding the price level constant, more spending occurs in the economy due to this impact of people's incomes rising. Let's take another scenario. Let's say that the government decides to cut spending, cut lots of programs like Medicare or military spending. In that case, government spending is going down, and we would represent that not as a movement along the aggregate demand curve, but as a shift of the aggregate demand curve. So a decrease in spending of one of these factors translates graphically to a leftward shift or a decrease of the aggregate demand curve. A rightward shift represents an increase in spending. So another scenario that we could consider is suppose that the U.S. Produces more goods and services that they export abroad, that they sell outside of the U.S. In that case, a rise in exports would also cause an increase in aggregate demand and be represented as a rightward shift of the aggregate demand curve. The key thing to remember that whenever the price level changes, that causes a movement along a single aggregate demand curve. Everything else that can impact one of these spending categories in the economy is represented as a shift of the aggregate demand curve.